The first thing Lieutenant Rourke did when she walked into that briefing tent was set down his coffee, look at the rifle case across her back like it was a piece of furniture somebody had left in the wrong room, and say to the master sergeant beside him, loud enough for all of them, I requested a shooter. They sent me a hood ornament. 11 men laughed, not nervous laughter, not the kind that dies fast when nobody joins. The easy, settled laughter of people who have already decided the joke is safe, because the person it lands on has no power to make them pay for it. She was 5'1". She was 114 pounds with her boots on, and the rifle on her back, broken down in its hard case, could put a round through an engine block at 1.5 miles. The lieutenant just called her a hood ornament in front of his whole team, and not one of them looked at her to see how it landed. If this is your first time with Valor Stories, do me a favor and follow this one all the way to the end, because what she did on that mountain is the kind of thing that shouldn't have been possible. And drop a comment. Tell me what town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this travels. Now, let's get into it. The bird touched down at a forward base she'd never heard of at 4:20 in the morning, and nobody came to the pad. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, filing it somewhere behind her eyes. When a specialist gets attached to a team, even a support element, even somebody who's only going to ride along and watch a ridgeline, somebody comes out with a vehicle. That's not warmth. That's just how it's done. You send a private with a clipboard and a bad attitude, but you send somebody. She stood on the ramp with the cold cutting through her, that high country cold that has teeth, and she waited the way she'd learned to wait. 30 seconds. A minute. There was only the engine noise winding down behind her and the sodium lights of the base, throwing a sick orange glow across the snowpacked ground and the black wall of mountains to the south that she could feel more than see. So she shouldered her ruck, balanced the case so it didn't drag her sideways, and she walked toward the lights by herself. Her name was Sloan. She was 31 years old. She had been shooting since she was 8, when her grandfather, a man who'd spent 2 wars and 40 winters reading wind off mountainsides, put a little .22 in her hands on a ridge above the Bitterroot and told her that stillness was a thing you earned, not a thing you were born with. He told her the mountain would show her everything it was hiding if she could just be quiet long enough to deserve it. She'd believed him at 8. She believed him harder now. She'd grown up small and stayed small, the kind of small that got her handed crayons in restaurants well into her 20s, the kind of small that made every recruiter and every instructor and every man in every room run the same fast math behind their eyes the second she walked in. She doesn't belong here. She'd been answering that math for 9 years. She was good at it. That didn't mean it stopped costing her something every single time. The gate guard checked her ID, checked her face, checked the ID again, like the two of them refused to agree. You're the sniper attachment? That's right. He pointed her to the 3rd building on the left and added, almost apologetically, that they'd already started. She looked at her watch. The brief wasn't supposed to go until 5. They'd moved it up by 40 minutes and nobody had bothered to tell her. And she filed that away too, in the same quiet place where she kept everything that was designed to make her feel like she'd shown up late to a party she was never invited to. So she opened the door and the room went still in that particular way. Rooms go still when something unexpected walks in. Not surprise, but judgment. 11 men arriving at the same silent conclusion at the same time. And Rourke, standing at the front beside a map pinned to plywood, gave her the verdict before she'd cleared the threshold. Hence the hood ornament. Hence the laughter. She didn't argue. She found a folding chair near the middle, set her case down with the care you give something that's worth more than the people mocking it, and she opened her data book and started reading the map. The job was a recovery. 2 American contractors taken 11 days ago, held by an armed faction operating out of a string of valleys, in the high country roughly 40 miles south. The intel said the hostages were alive and getting shuttled between hide sites every couple of days. The window to grab them was tight and getting tighter, and the approach Rourke had drawn ran straight up a draw, a long, narrow cut between 2 ridgelines, good concealment from the air, almost no vehicle traffic. On paper, it was the smart route. She read the draw once, then again, then a 3rd time, slow, the way she read terrain when something about it was bothering her in a way she couldn't name yet. And then she could name it. She raised her hand. Rourke looked at her the way a man looks at an interruption. Sloan, the draw, she said. The east wall runs a series of shelves and overhangs. stepped at maybe 200-meter intervals all the way up. The route puts the whole team underneath every one of them for about 3 clicks of movement. If anybody's got an elevated position on that wall, we walk the entire team through their field of fire, and we never see them coming. Imagery's clean, Rourke said. Imagery's 3 days old. The snowfall pattern in this valley over the last 48 hours. We reviewed the imagery. He said it slower the second time. The careful enunciation a man uses when he's explaining something to someone he's already decided can't follow it. This element has run 61 missions in 4 countries. I appreciate you studying the map on the flight. When I want a second opinion on the approach, I'll ask the people who've earned the right to give one. The room was very quiet. Off to her right, the master sergeant, big man, gray at the temples, the kind of calm that comes from having survived a great deal, looked at her with something that wasn't quite sympathy. The way you look at somebody about to embarrass themselves, and you feel just bad enough to notice and not bad enough to step in. Understood, sir, she said, and she went back to the map. But she kept her thumb on that east wall, and she kept thinking about the shelves and the angles and the 3-day-old pictures and the snow. When Rourke assigned movement positions at the end of the brief, he named every man and his role in crisp order. He didn't name her, so she asked, and he looked at her with the deliberate lazy casualness that was its own kind of cruelty and said she'd move behind the main element, last slot before rear security. Every man in that tent understood what that meant. In a combat formation, that's not a position. That's cargo. That's something you're transporting, not someone who's contributing. A couple of them understood it loudly, with their faces. She counted to 3 behind her eyes and said, "Copy that, sir," and she folded her book. Outside in the cold between the tent and the motor pool, she did what she always did after a room like that. She stopped, she breathed, and she put it some way. You can't put a thing like that away, but somewhere it wouldn't get into the work. She had work to do. She found the master sergeant at the vehicles an hour later, running checks on the lead truck. His name was Doyle. He had the look of a man who'd stopped performing confidence a long time ago because he no longer needed to. She told him she wanted 5 honest minutes, and something in his face recalibrated. "The draw," she said. "You've looked at it. It's the LT's call. That's not what I asked you." His jaw worked. He looked at the mountains, then back at her. The east wall's got 4 natural firing positions that put overlapping fire on that route, and the draw only exits south. You take contact in there, you've got one direction to run, and they already know which one. He said it flat, like he was reading it off the inside of his own skull. "I know." Then why isn't anybody saying it? For a second, she thought she saw respect cross his face. Then it folded back under the easier expression he wore. Because the lieutenant made the call, and the lieutenant's got 61 missions and an intel package that says the draw's clean, 3-day-old intel, 3-day-old intel, he agreed, agreeing with none of it. Then he was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, her name came out different. Not warm, real. "I'm not your chain of command, Sloan. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'll tell you this much. Whatever you decide, you'd better be right. Because if you're wrong, your career ends in this valley." He pushed off the truck. "And if you're right, you'd still better be right." She stood at the vehicle line in the dark with the cold and the diesel and the black shape of the high ground to the south, and she thought about her grandfather on a ridge above the Bitterroot, telling her the mountain keeps its secrets until you earn them. She thought about 11 men walking through a 3-mile kill box while she trailed behind them like a duffel bag. And she thought about the peak. She'd seen it on the map during the brief. A steep, ugly shoulder of rock and ice the route would pass maybe half a mile to the west of, marked at its summit with an elevation that put it more than 2,000 feet over the valley floor. Nobody had mentioned it because it wasn't on the plan. It was just a mountain. But from up there, with the right glass and the right discipline, you could see the entire draw, the whole killing ground, every one of those 4 positions on the east wall. She thought about it for a long time. The convoy staged at the south gate just after 7. She stood at the rear of the column where Rourke had put her, watching the sky go from black to a deep bruised purple, and when Rourke came down the line for final checks, he stopped in front of her, looked at her ruck and her case and her, and said, "You going to keep up? Not are you ready? Just, can you carry the weight? If you fall behind, you stay behind. This isn't a babysitting run." "I understand, sir," she said quietly, and finished his sentence for him, and something flickered across his face that he didn't let stay. The trucks rolled south into a gray dawn that smelled like snow coming. 3 miles out, she found the peak in the growing light, rising off the range like something a child had drawn with hard, angry strokes. And she looked at it, and she looked at the dark cut of the draw, where the team would vanish in 40 minutes, and she looked back at the peak. Rourke had told her to stay behind. He'd told her not to slow his team. She had followed orders her whole career. When they were wrong, when they were demeaning, when they were built specifically to make her invisible, because she believed in the system, because she believed discipline was the thing that kept people alive. But she also believed 11 men were about to walk into a draw. She was now certain was a trap, and she believed in the mountain, and she believed in her grandfather's voice, and she believed in 3,000 hours of preparing for exactly this and never once knowing when it would come. The convoy slowed at the mouth of the draw. The team peeled off the vehicles, assembling with the quiet competence of men who'd done this dance 100 times. She dismounted at the back. She looked at the formation. She looked west at the mountain. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no surge of certainty that swept the fear away. The fear stayed. She knew exactly what disobeying a direct order in a combat zone meant. She knew that if she was wrong, she'd lose 9 years of clawing for every inch she had, and that Rourke would make sure she never saw an operational assignment again. She felt every ounce of it. Then she shouldered the case, turned west, and the woman they'd called a hood ornament walked away from the draw and toward the mountain, alone, into a wind that was starting to change direction in a way she didn't like at all. She didn't look back. She started to climb. The first time her hand slipped, she was 11 minutes up. Not a movie slip, not a scream off a cliff face. Just a quiet, sudden loss of grip where her fingers found a patch of rock-worn glassy by 1,000 years of weather. And her whole weight shifted wrong, and the case swung out like a pendulum and tried to take her with it. She drove her right hand into a crack, jammed 3 fingers, held, pressed her forehead to the stone, breathed once, twice, found her feet, kept moving. Nobody saw it. Nobody was watching. The convoy had already disappeared into the draw 2,000 feet below her, 11 men walking into a problem she could no longer warn them about. All she could do now was climb fast enough to matter. The rifle was the enemy. Not the mountain, not the cold, not the dark, the rifle. The system in its case ran better than 40 pounds with the glass and the rounds and the bipod packed tight around it and her ruck on top of that, and none of it distributed the way a body wants weight when it's going straight up. It pulled her backward. It torqued through her spine. Every time she reached for a hold, it shifted, and she fought the physics of it with nothing but muscle and the kind of stubbornness her grandfather had called the only inheritance worth a damn. She hit the first shelf at 20 minutes and lay flat 30 seconds, not resting, just letting her heart come down enough to think clean. Then up again, reading the slope, picking the next line. And at 31 minutes, she heard the wind change for real, and she stopped, and she stood dead still and turned her face into it. She'd grown up in high country. She knew the sound a wind makes before weather, the way it goes from steady to restless, probing like something alive that hasn't decided yet where it wants to go. It was coming. The storm she'd watched building in the forecast slides, the one she'd mentioned in that briefing, and nobody had cared about. A front that was going to drop visibility across the whole valley to nothing inside of a few hours. She'd built it into her timeline. She needed a stable firing position on that summit before it hit, which gave her maybe 90 minutes. She climbed faster. At 43 minutes, the burning in her shoulders crossed from pain into something with teeth. She acknowledged it and kept going. Pain was information. As long as the information was this hurts but nothing's failing, she could work with it. You're not tired, she told herself, out loud, quiet, the way she'd learned on long stalks and longer climbs. You're just working. A rock crumbled under her boot and she dropped half a foot before her other foot caught a ledge, and her hands found the wall and the case swung hard, and for one honest second she was hanging by one boot and both hands with 60 pounds trying to peel her into open air. She pressed flat, breathed, found the next hold. Okay, she said, okay, and kept climbing. The chimney came at 58 minutes, a vertical crack maybe 18 inches wide, running straight up for what looked like 40 feet. You climb a chimney with your back on one wall and your boots on the other, friction and opposing pressure, and it's miserable with a day pack. With a 40-pound case on her back, there was no way to get her spine flat to the rock, so she had to wedge one shoulder and twist, working up 6 inches at a time, loading her body at angles that were going to cost her a long conversation with a physical therapist somewhere down the line. Halfway up, her left arm started to shake. Not the controlled burn of a working muscle, but the deep involuntary tremor of one approaching its actual limit. She'd felt it once before on a training peak in Colorado, and she did now what she'd done then. Registered it, didn't panic, shifted load to her right arm, gave the left a partial rest without stopping, and kept going. She came out the top at 67 minutes and lay on the ledge with both arms shaking and her heart doing something she couldn't call a rhythm. She had a little time left. She got up. The last face was shorter and steeper, and the wind was serious now, no longer probing but committed, coming hard out of the northwest, with the violence of mountain air that's made up its mind. The first snow came with it, fine and stinging, driving sideways. She climbed by feel as much as sight, hands reading the rock ahead of her face, and at 81 minutes, hands torn open and bleeding from the chimney she hadn't noticed bleeding during the climb, she pulled herself over the lip and onto the summit. She had no time to feel like she'd done anything. A storm was clawing at the air. She had a rifle to assemble and a position to build and a firing solution to solve in a wind that was going to lie to her with every gust. And below, invisible, unreachable by radio, 11 men were walking toward what she was now almost certain was the last walk some of them would take. She unstrapped the case and opened it with bleeding hands and built the rifle from muscle memory she'd practiced 10,000 times in the dark and the cold and the wet, because she'd always known that when it came for real, it would not be easy. She deployed the bipod. She went prone behind a fin of rock that broke the worst of the wind. She found the mouth of the draw in her glass, even through the building haze, and she could see, she was almost sure she could see, small figures moving at its northern end. The team, at the bottom, walking in. She put her eye to the scope and started working the east wall, and there they were, not all at once. The first was a heat shimmer that resolved as she watched into the unmistakable shape of a man lying prone with a weapon. She moved the glass, found the second. The third, half behind a rock but visible from her angle above. She kept scanning, patient and methodical, the way her grandfather had taught her. The mountain shows you what it's hiding if you hold still long enough to earn it. 7 positions on the east wall. At least 7, and she hadn't finished the sweep. Exactly what she'd told Rourke. Exactly what he'd waved off in front of his whole team. She keyed her radio. Rourke, this is Sloan. I have eyes on hostile positions. East wall. 7 confirmed, possibly more. The draw is a kill box. Do not advance past phase line 2. I say again, static. Then his voice sharp. Sloan, where the hell are you? Summit of the high ground west of your route. I've got thermal and optics on at least 7 prepared positions, covering your whole approach. They're waiting on you. They know you're coming. A pause, long enough that she scanned again and found the 8th, a mortar crew setting up behind a slab of rock, maybe 800 meters above the valley floor. You abandoned your assigned position, Rourke said, and his voice had gone cold and flat. You disobeyed a direct order. You are going to stand down, you are going to get off this net, and you are going to. The first blast lit the bottom of the draw, not the mortar, an RPG off the east wall, slamming into the rock just ahead of the point man, close enough to knock him flat, far enough that he was still alive when the sound reached her a full second later, racing up the mountain ahead of the chaos that flooded the team net. Contact left, RPG east wall. Get off the trail. Where's it coming from? I can't see it. She'd already stopped listening. She was working. The mortar was the priority. Everything on that wall was bad, but a tube dropping rounds into that draw would end the mission, and most of those men in 5 minutes. She ranged it. She read the wind, gusting now, variable, and she knew she'd have to send the round inside the lull between gusts. She found the crew, 3 men, 1 on the tube, 1 feeding, 1 spotting, and she picked the one on the tube first, because without him the other 2 were just men standing on a mountain. She waited. The wind paused. She fired. The rifle bucked into her shoulder, and she was cycling the bolt before the round arrived, which it did. She saw the crew's motion stop in the abrupt, total way. Motion stops when something terrible arrives without warning, and she was already moving to the next target before the report finished crossing the valley. The net erupted. What was that? Where'd that come from? East wall position 3 is down. No, that came from above us. And then Doyle's voice cutting through with a clarity she recognized as a man understanding something all at once. Sloan. Sloan, is that you on the high ground? She fired again. Cycled. Found the 3rd. And Doyle's voice came back different. Not questioning, not commanding, something she'd never once heard aimed at her in 9 years of service. Something close to awe. That's Sloane. She's on the mountain. She's on top of the goddamn mountain. They started to react to her then. Men who'd been fixed entirely on the draw below, suddenly turning, scanning the high ground, hunting for where the fire was coming from. The moment they found her, every weapon up there would swing toward the summit, and the whole shape of the fight would change. She had minutes, maybe less. She moved her position 3 meters left along the summit after every shot. Always move, because a good shooter orients on your flash, and you've got about 4 seconds. And she found the 9th position as she shifted, a counter snipper at the far end of the wall, disciplined, scanning, working toward her with professional patience. She didn't give him time to finish. She fired. She moved. Then the storm arrived whole. Not the building edge of it, the body, a wall of wind and driven snow that turned the world white and solid and screaming. Visibility through the glass went from clear to nothing in under a minute. The thermal became the only thing keeping her in the fight. Orange shapes against cold stone. Men trying to understand what was killing them from the sky. Rourke's voice broke through the static, stripped of everything it had carried that morning. 2 down. Briggs is hit bad. Can't extract. Birds grounded in this. Need suppression. East wall positions 4 through 6. We cannot move. She found them in the thermal. The wind had gone from a problem to almost impossible, gusting and dropping and gusting again. And shooting through it meant not reading the wind, that was but predicting the wind that would be in the 1.5 between the rifle and the target. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done with a gun. She did it anyway. 4. Gone she moved. 5. Gone. 6 was harder. The man was mostly behind cover, exposed only when he rose to fire, so she clocked his rhythm, the interval between his bursts, and on the 4th cycle she was already there, already waiting when he lifted his head. The signature dropped. 4 through 6 are down, she said, steadier than she felt. 2 left on the east wall. What's your status? Static. Then Rourke and his voice had changed again. Not the cold command, not the certainty from the briefing tent, something with the armor off. 2 dead, 3 wounded, me included. Briggs won't make it if we don't get him out inside 20 minutes. A pause with things inside it. Sloane, how many can you still see? She swept the thermal across the ridge and stopped. There's a technical staged at the south end of the wall. Armed truck. They held it in reserve, and it's moving. Repositioning to fire down into your position. Distance. She ranged it, 1,100 meters from me. Can you hit a moving vehicle at 1,100 in this? She watched the heat of the engine slide across the stone, slow, maybe 10 miles an hour, predictable. I can hit it. A silence. Then Rourke said something she'd never expected to hear from him. Quiet, no theater in it at all, like it was simply the truest thing he had. Then please. She built it in her head. The lead, the wind that wouldn't hold still, the round that would fly for over a second and have to arrive at a point in space. Her reading of a lying wind said the truck would occupy when it got there. She breathed out. She stilled. The gust peaked and began to fall, and she fired, and the engine block came apart. The truck went from moving to dead, inside second, the hood flying up, then fire, bright in the thermal even through the white. The net was quiet a beat, then Doyle, barely audible. Did she just kill a truck? And Rourke said nothing, but she could hear his breathing on the open channel, alive, steady, and for the first time since she'd walked into that tent, completely unable to tell her she was wrong. She found the last 2 on the wall and sent the rounds by heat alone, 2 shapes going still against the gray. And the draw went quiet. Not the quiet of safety. The wounded were still wounded. Briggs was still bleeding into the snow. The bird was still grounded. But the shooting stopped. The wall was still. The mortar was silent. The truck was burning. And below her through the storm, she heard the team net come back to life, men organizing, calling for the medic, Doyle's voice steady as he ran the casualty collection. Alive. The ones who could be. Alive. She'd done it. And then, in the space between one order and the next, she heard Rourke say something not to her but to his team, quiet enough she nearly lost it in the wind. Find her a way down. 4 words. 20 minutes earlier, the same man had called her a hood ornament and pointed at her like a clerical error. Now he was using the voice he kept men alive with to make sure she got off that mountain. The way down was worse than the way up. The storm had remade the slope, not on any map, but in the practical sense that the line she'd climbed in the dark was now inside a whiteout that gave her 8 feet of visibility and turned every loose rock into something the wind could throw. Doyle talked her onto the east face, a gully system out of the direct wind, and she found it and went into it, and it was steeper than the map had promised, less climbing than controlled falling. Her boots breaking against the walls and the case forever, trying to swing ahead of her and take her face off. The bird had a 30-minute window before the weather closed the landing zone for good, and the math on her descent was not good math, and she ran it once and put it away. Math didn't get you off a mountain, movement did. 12 minutes down, she hit a fresh rockfall blocking the gully, had to traverse a 2-foot ledge slick with new snow, went down to one knee on it with nothing below her but broken stone, pressed into the wall, found her feet, kept going. She stopped managing the descent and started committing to it, half running, half sliding, using the case as a counterweight instead of fighting it, letting momentum do the work her wrecked muscles couldn't. She was 10 meters from flat ground when the wall behind her, the section she'd been touching for balance, finally gave up, sliding first in pieces and then all at once. And she threw herself forward in a full lunge onto the debris fan, and the leading edge of it caught the tail of her ruck and hit her in the back like a truck and drove her face first into the snow. Then, comparative silence. The storm still screamed, but the mountain had stopped. She moved her fingers. They moved. Her feet. They moved. She pushed up against the weight on her back, and it shifted and came off, and she got her boots under her and stood in the snow at the base of the mountain, dust and rock and white blowing around her. Two shapes came out of the storm at a dead run. Doyle hit her first, grabbed her by the shoulders, not gentle, the grip of a large man checking whether what he grabbed is still a person. Hands going to her face, checking her eyes. "I'm functional," she told him, and her voice came out flat and far away from the other side of the adrenaline wall. There was blood on her side she hadn't felt, a rock fragment from the collapse, deep enough to bleed, not deep enough to be the emergency his face thought it was. Behind him, Pruitt, the loud red-haired one, was already pulling debris off the rifle case and asking if the system was okay. And she told him it was in a hard case, it was fine, and she asked about Briggs, and something crossed Pruitt's face and he said, the medic had him. It was close, they had to move. They moved. They found the rest of the team at the eastern mouth of the draw, and Roark was on his feet, holding his side, and his eyes found her and stayed on her. Not on the situation, not the tactical picture, on her. And the first thing he said was, "You're hit." Then he made the medic, a young specialist named Vance, who looked like he'd aged 5 years that morning, stop and work on her side while she stood in the storm, and let him, because Roark told her to. And there was something underneath the order she hadn't heard from him before. The bird came in blind on GPS, a ghost out of the white, 20 feet over the snow, with the rotor wash adding itself to the storm. They loaded Briggs first, Vance keeping pressure all the way through the door, then the wounded, then the rest, and Rourke stood at the door, counting them in. The old non-negotiable arithmetic of a commander, making sure the number going in matches the number that came out. When Sloan reached the door, he put his hand out, not a handshake. The way you put your hand out to help someone through a doorway, when you've decided the person on the other side of it belongs inside. She took it. He pulled her through. 2 days later, in a base hospital that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, she was reading the after-action report he'd written. 12 pages, accurate, and accuracy had required him to put his own command errors in the permanent record in plain language. She got to page 7 and stopped. The last line of the section on what she'd done read that the survival of the team, the destruction of a prepared ambush, and the recovery of the mission were attributable in their entirety to the independent action of Sergeant Sloan, that her threat assessment was correct, that the standing order she'd violated was the author's own, that the judgment which overrode it was hers, and that the record should reflect this without ambiguity. "You didn't have to write it this way," she said. "This reflects on your command. I know how to write a report that's accurate and still makes me look good," Rourke said. "I've done it for 11 years. There's a difference between what's accurate and what's honest, and I've spent enough time on the wrong side of it." He met her eyes. "This one's going to be honest." She thought about her grandfather telling her she'd have to be twice as good to be taken half as seriously, and that the only answer to math like that was to get so good the math stopped mattering. She'd done the math on that mountain. 9 shots through a whiteout from a summit nobody thought she could reach, at distances his best men wouldn't have tried, and she hadn't missed once. That night, the mess hall was nearly empty. When she sat alone at the end of a table near the wall, where she always sat, where she'd sat for 9 years, in the place that asked the least of anyone else's willingness to include her. Then the door opened, and Doyle came in, and Pruitt and Vance, and Briggs's name on everybody's mouth because Briggs was going to live, and 4 more behind them, and Rourke last because the commander comes last. There were 11 empty tables. They walked to hers. Doyle pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without a word, and the others filled in around her, not at a polite distance, but packed in close, the way you sit with people you've decided you belong with. Nobody made a speech. The table that had been 1 became a dozen, and that was the whole statement. She picked up her fork. Pruitt stole a roll out of the basket like he owned it. Vance started arguing with someone about the weight limit on the helicopter, and she felt the things she'd carried for 9 years, in the wall seat at the end of the table. In every room she'd entered as furniture, she felt it shift, not release. Just move, the way a very heavy thing moves when the weight on one side finally changes. She'd been 5'1" her whole life. She'd carried 60 pounds up a mountain in the dark and held 9 men's lives steady through a storm with a rifle. And she had not been too small. She had been exactly enough. She'd always been tall enough. She just needed a mountain to make them look up.